Good morning. Good morning. Welcome. Love this. Welcome. This is the 12th Institute on Theology and Disability. And here we are at the lovely George W. Truett Theological Seminary at Baylor. Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. I'm Shelley Christensen, and I'm a member of the Coordinating Council for the Institute. My pronouns are she and hers. I'm a white woman with curly shoulder-length brown hair, brown eyes. I'm wearing purple glasses and a mid-length pastel sundress. I stand 5 feet 6 inches tall, down from my former height of 5'8". Don't ask. I want to introduce the Coordinating Council members. Some are here today, some are online. So big shout out to my colleagues, Keith Dow, is over there. Topher Endres, who will be here in a bit, and Kathy Dixon and Kathy Webb. So whether you're here in Waco, Texas, or you're attending through the wonders of Zoom, we are all so glad that you're here. We've been planning this institute for many months, and here we are at last. I would like to open the institute with a blessing from my tradition, from the Jewish tradition. The blessing is called the Shehechianu, and we recite this blessing at the beginning of a holiday or on a special occasion. And what is more special than all of us coming together and gathering today? So, start with the Hebrew. It's short. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam shehechianu v'kiyamanu v'higianu lazman hazeh. Praised are you, Spirit of the universe, who keeps us alive, sustains us, and brings us to this moment. Amen. All of us know through our own experiences and the sacred work that we're called to do that no one does this alone. Please join me in expressing gratitude to our Institute sponsors: Baylor Press, Baylor University, Baylor Truett Theological Seminary, the Center for Developmental Disabilities, Department of Religion, Institute for Faith and Learning Ethics Ethics Initiatives in Medical Humanities, the Texas Council on Developmental Disabilities, Faith Inclusion Network, Christian Horizons, and Respectability. Yes, please. Our friends and colleagues here in Texas have given invaluable support to the Institute, and I want to thank them all. David Aycock of Baylor Press, Tom Jones of Faith Inclusion Network, Meg Wallace and Mobilize Waco, Bill Gaventa, the founder and director emeritus of the Institute on Theology and Disability, Devin Stahl, assistant professor of religion at Baylor University, Erik Carter, the executive director of the Baylor Center on Developmental Disabilities. And let's also thank Erik. Let's also thank Erik and his team for hosting Community Day and providing the wonderful treats you are enjoying this morning and during the afternoon break from Biddy and Bose. Speaking of Biddy and Bose, let's welcome the employees who will be providing today's breaks and afternoon breaks throughout the day and throughout. They'll be here today, and then they'll be returning in the afternoons for coffee breaks as well. Their motto is a human rights movement disguised as a coffee shop. People with disabilities are employed in all parts of the organization. They wait on customers, make a great cup of Java, and they serve up a whole lot more than a cup of coffee. I want to thank my colleague Ben Bond, who works with me in the Faith, Inclusion, and Belonging Department at Respectability, and Katie Grosch for all of their support during this week of the Institute. Now, quick housekeeping. There's always housekeeping notes. So those of you watching on Zoom, you know what to do. So we have 2 breaks at 10:40 and 2:30. Lunch is provided, except those of you who have a pink sticker on your name badge. When you go out for lunch, for breaks, please go out the exit. David is holding the door open right there. It is facing away from the podium. It will be to your right at the back of the room. And the food tables, you're going to just go around the courtyard, the inside of the courtyard, for the food tables for later, for lunch and for dinner. If you requested a food accommodation, please let the folks at the food table know. And you can all come back in here for lunch. Water is also available in the hallway through the left back exit. Lots of water, and you have those beautiful crystal imitation water glasses that we ordered. An accessible gender-neutral washroom is in the low sensory room, and feel free and please attend to your own comfort. The low sensory room is immediately to your right as you exit out the door, the right side of the back of the room. There are also tables and chairs in the halls around the courtyard for your convenience. Let us know if you need something, and we'll do our best to help you. The folks at the registration table will be able to help in accessing what you need. Be sure to visit the resource tables in the entrance hall out the right back door. There are tons of great book selections and also handouts and free stuff. So check it out. All that said, it is my great honor to introduce Dr. Todd Still, the Dean of Truett Theological Seminary.
Thank you, Shelley. It is my honor to welcome you to Baylor University and to the George W. Truett Theological Seminary. For those of you who may not know anything about Baylor, that's absolutely fine. Would you suffer me just a few thoughts about our university? It was founded in 1845 by the Republic of Texas. Baylor has been a university longer than Texas has been a state. And it was founded in Independence, Texas, which is to the south and to the east, not far from College Station. I think there's a university there, too. And I know there's a university there. Agam Giggies, Gigam Aggies. I married into an Aggie family, wonderful people. My father-in-law was in the Corps. My brother-in-law was in the Corps, so I say they're hardcore. Baylor moved to Waco in 1886, and Truett Theological Seminary is one of the 12 schools and colleges that comprise Baylor, which is a large private, around 20,000 students. Truett is relatively small herself. 350 students are enrolled. We began in 1991, started offering classes in 1994, had our first graduates in 1997. We have 1,860 alums. Baylor has 160,000 living alumni. This building began to be used in the spring of 2002, dedicated on February 22nd, 2002. That's a date that even I can remember, 2/22/2002. I got that. And so 325,000 square feet, and believe it or not, somehow, some way, we've run out of room. George Truett was born in 1867 in North Carolina. He moved to with his family to hardscrabble northeast Texas called Whitewright not far from Denton, when he was around 20. Quick story about Truett: hired by Baylor University before he was a student, helped to eradicate $92,000 in debt, enrolled in the school that he helped to save, graduated 1897, and from 1897 to 1944, he had one job. He was the pastor of the First Baptist Church of Dallas. I might say a very different First Baptist Church of Dallas, let the hearer understand. And Truett, on one occasion, was invited to be the president of Baylor. In 1910, he declined and he said, "I prayed that the Lord would give me a shepherd's heart. He answered my prayer. Thank you for the invitation. I'll remain where I am." So, welcome to Baylor, welcome to Truett. Thank you for allowing us to host you. So many remarkable thought leaders on theology and disability, so many remarkable practitioners. We are honored by your presence in this place, and we hope that you can achieve your vision, which is clearly articulated. And I trust that this institute, the 12th Institute, will enable you to do so more and more. The final thing that I want to say is I want you to know that we are here to serve you. Please let us know how we can be more helpful. Please do not hesitate to reach out to any Truett student, any Truett staff member. We want to assist in any way that we possibly can. So, again, welcome to Texas. I can do nothing about the weather. I hope the courtyard is not as hot as I fear it might be. If you get too cool in this room, which you may do, please reach out. We can adjust the thermostat, not very easily, or not very quickly, but we can adjust the thermostat. We want to be good hosts. You honor us by your presence. Welcome, friends.
Thank you so much, Dr. Still, and thank you for the hospitality here and the generous support that we've received. I was going to talk to you about the weather, but then I realized, it's like nobody in this room would be to whom we should speak of changing the weather for the better. It's like, anybody listening? So thank you. Well, let's get the Institute on Theology and Disability 2023 started. Let's give a great big Texas-style welcome to the new Executive Director of Baylor University's Center for Developmental Disabilities, Dr. Erik Carter. He has been on the core faculty of the Institute on Theology and Disabilities since its inception in 2010, and he and his family recently moved to Waco. Erik's research and writing focus on principle-driven research-based strategies for promoting inclusion, relationships, and valued roles for children and adults with intellectual and developmental disabilities. Erik addresses the spiritual lives and flourishing of people with IDD and their families, and the practices and postures of inclusive churches and faith-based partnerships with disability service systems. And Erik, it's been such a joy to know you all these years. Congratulations on your new post. So without further ado, let's get started. Welcome, Dr. Erik Carter. Break a leg.
Well, thank you, Shelley, and all the members of the core council for the Institute on Theology and Disability, just for this opportunity. And of course, my deep gratitude goes to Dr. Still and Truett Seminary for hosting this year's gathering. It's a joy to be with all of you, among new friends and old friends, among so many people who are calling and equipping congregations to be accessible and inviting communities. Communities that embrace people with disabilities and their families, that are enriched by their presence, that ache or are incomplete because of their absence. And I've been looking forward to this day, this whole week actually, where we can gain encouragement and insight from one another in our shared work of changing the landscape of disability ministry all throughout this state, all around the country, and all throughout the world. My name is Erik Carter, and by way of visual description, I'm a little over 6 foot tall. I've got graying hair and a beard. I'm wearing a gray polo shirt standing behind a wooden podium, and I'm just thrilled to be with you. Now, I'll be preaching this morning, since I am in a seminary, from the book of, or from Numbers. Actually, that's the wrong image that I put up, which is a photo of the book of Numbers. I'm actually going to preach from literal Numbers, which is, if you know me, as a researcher and professor here at Baylor University, I study the place of faith and faith in the lives of people with developmental disabilities and their families, and the movements of churches that either embrace or exclude them, and the pathways to inclusion and belonging for all. But I think so many of the findings that I'll share from our research this morning, I think align with what scriptures say matters most as we strive to love God and to love one another as one body, without asterisks, without exceptions. Now, you might be surprised to learn that there are more than 350,000 local congregations across the United States. Now, since moving here to Waco in January, I've learned that almost all of those seem to be actually here in Waco. You might have noticed. We'll come back to that in just a minute. 350,000 local congregations, an incredible diversity of denominations and faith traditions varied in size and membership and history and culture. And each of those congregations is planted in a city or a town filled with people with disabilities. Each of those 350,000 congregations already include members experiencing disability or chronic illness or mental health challenges. Perhaps that's surprising to some of you who are just joining these conversations. There are more than 70 million Americans with disabilities residing in every neighborhood throughout this state. If you walk into our local schools, 1 in 7 children under 18 is receiving special education services. 1 in 4 young people experience a serious mental health condition. More than half of all seniors over 65 report some form of impairment. To make those kinds of abstract numbers concrete, if we were to roam through the neighborhoods that surround each of our own faith communities and began knocking on doors, we discovered that 1 in 3 households includes at least one member impacted by disability. It could be these homes. I've placed a photo on the screen that shows a neighborhood looking down from a satellite showing about 400 houses. There's a yellow circle on every 3rd house. When we hear that biblical question, who's my neighbor, our answers must never be too narrow. Disability is an ordinary and expected aspect of the human experience. So as people committed to loving our neighbors, serving our communities, and widening our welcome, these numbers should lead us towards reflection. Who might still be missing from our midst? Do our invitations abound? Is where and how we gather as a faith community somehow limiting who arrives or whoever returns? How might we come alongside people well in all aspects of their lives? And what will be our witness to a watching world? The call on our congregations is clear, and that's going to be unpacked through the various sessions today and throughout the week. We're to be lavish in our hospitality, to receive every gift, to invite those who have been uninvited or never invited, and to love deeply beyond our usual circles. This is the way in which excluded people are re-seen as indispensable and integral, as needed and as loved. Indeed, the position statements of so many of our faith traditions emphasize variations on this point. We are to embrace far more than we exclude. So the call is clear, but what has been the church's response in this area? Well, to help answer that question, I want to share some insights on the current landscape of disability and ministry in Christian faith communities all across the United States. It's a portrait in some way of our collective response. You see, last year, my students and I completed the first national study of this burgeoning movement. We had extended interviews and surveys with 200 ministry leaders representing churches in 48 states. We never met anyone, never found a church in West Virginia or Hawaii, so we are willing to expand recruitment if you have some connections there as well. But we are trying to capture the practices and the postures of churches that are moving intentionally in this space, that are noticeably active in their efforts to be a faith community in which people with and without disabilities worship and learn and lead and serve and fellowship together with one another. So with that snapshot, sort of thinking about this study that we've conducted, what can I share in just 35 minutes that might be interesting and move us forward in this conversation? What I thought I would do is share some brief historical context that I think helps characterize the movements of those 200 congregations. I'm then going to highlight 4 encouraging trends, and then I'm going to suggest 4 areas where more or different movements might be needed. And I'll conclude then with some thoughts on how we might move forward together to change this landscape further and faster. But when I end the talk, we'll transition right into table discussions focused on 3 questions, and I put those up on the screen. What insights do you have from your own ministries and experiences? Second, what challenges and questions arise in this area for you? And third, which portraits of community describe your own congregation and why? So consider connections between our findings and your own experiences, and off we go. Now, my own research focuses primarily on children and youth with intellectual and developmental disabilities. And so I'd like to share a bit about how the postures and the practices of communities have changed dramatically over the last 50 years as it relates to these young people. And to illustrate this, I thought I'd share a sort of a short bit of history, again, for many of you who are new to these conversations. Others of you, this may be very familiar to as well. But sometimes a glimpse backwards can help us see where we want to go forward. Now, I turned 50 this year, which my children tell me makes me quite old. I protest vigorously, and then they remind me that I was born back in the 1900s, and then that sounds old, and I have to relent. But I'm 50 years old, and the time I was born in 1973, individuals with intellectual and developmental disabilities were still excluded from so many aspects of community life. Denied access to local schools and to workplaces and neighborhoods as they grew up, and from so many other available activities. There were holes, our communities were incomplete. The image on the screen depicts a set of 50 circles, each in different shades of gray and all arranged tightly to form one larger filled-in circle. But a dozen of those smaller circles are missing, and it's labeled exclusion underneath. Well, things began to change throughout the 70s and 80s as new spaces and programs were created for children and adults with intellectual disability to learn and work and live and recreate. But those opportunities were usually provided in separate settings, apart from anyone else who didn't have the same label. And in most communities, people with and without intellectual disability lived life apart from one another. I've added a second image to the right that's largely the same as the first, but now there are a dozen blue circles clustered together decidedly outside of the larger circle to the bottom right, and that portrait's labeled segregation. Well, in the 1990s and the 2000s, the shift was towards ensuring that children and adults with developmental disabilities were integrated within the ordinary aspects of community life. Schools and businesses and community programs expanded considerably, but so often the opportunities that emerged still involved a certain separation. Different classes or specialized programs often placed people with developmental disabilities near, but not really among their peers without disabilities. A special education classroom down a rarely traveled hallway, a group home tucked in a part of the community that people rarely traveled down. There's a huge difference between being near and being among one another. I've now added to the screen a third image to the right that's also similar to the first, except those dozen blue circles are now clustered together within the larger circle next to one another, but not spread among the others. And this portrait is labeled integration. And that takes us to the present day, where our focus has been so often fixed on the inclusion of people with developmental disabilities in the same classrooms and clubs and community groups and colleges as anyone else. Inclusion from being apart from one another to being among one another to being with one another. I've added a fourth image now to the right of the others. It's the same as the first, except those dozen blue circles are now spread throughout the larger circle adjacent to the others, and this portrait is labeled inclusion. But there's still one more destination that we're striving towards, one that lies beyond integration and inclusion. It's to be a community where belonging abounds, where we all come to see one another in fundamentally different ways, not as the ins and the outs or the members and the strangers, but a diverse community in which each person has equal and immeasurable value, where we do more than just share space, but we also share lives, right? We become knitted together, woven into relationships, and we remain involved in each other's lives beyond the benediction, after class ends, after we clock out of work. I've added a fifth and final image to those four that changes the 50 small circles to an array of different colors. In addition, several pairs and trios of those circles have moved together outside of the circle in small groups. Do these strike you as very different portraits of community life? This progression of history reflects a movement from the margins toward the middle, from exclusion to embrace, and I share them to start off for two primary reasons. First, it turns out this was not actually a lesson about past history at all. This is our present landscape. These are the prevailing models of ministry and religious education that we see right now all around the country, all across the state. Exclusion, segregation, integration, inclusion, and belonging exist side by side, almost like a living history museum in some ways. And perhaps surprisingly, they sometimes exist side by side even within our faith communities. But the second reason I share them is they prompt our own reflection on the communities in which we worship and serve and lead. Which of these most closely resembles the communities that you care most about? And what might it take to transform our faith communities into places of inclusion and of belonging? Well, let's turn now back to that study that I mentioned at the outset, this national study of 200 churches around the country. We learned a lot from studying their postures and their practices, and these were all congregations that were in some way intentional about being more accessible and inviting. So what are those four encouraging trends that I might share? The first is that our faith communities seem to be stirring. I think God has long been calling us to widen our welcome. More and more congregations are finally responding. I'm convinced there's accelerating interest all across the country. I'm going to put up on the screen a cumulative figure depicting the launch dates of the formal ministries in our national study. The gold portion that's increasing shows that beginning in the 1960s and 1970s, there were just a few active churches in this area. A slow increase in the 80s and 90s, and then a steep acceleration throughout the last up to the present day. More than half of congregations' formal ministries were launched in the last decade. So more and more congregations are being intentional about this area. We asked those 200 leaders of these ministries who they were striving to support well, and their answers varied widely. But a focus on supports for autistic children, or on formal programs for children and adults with intellectual disability, or on broader accessibility for adults and seniors with physical disabilities were the most common focus of these ministries. Specifically, I'm going to put up on the screen the gold bar, the horizontal gold bar chart I placed on the screen indicates that 84% of these congregations supported autistic children or youth adults or adults in one or more ways. 84% focused on individuals with intellectual disability, 75% on those with physical disabilities, 69% on individuals with ADD, ADHD, or learning disabilities, half on individuals with hearing impairments or deafness, 44% on individuals with traumatic brain injury, 40% on individuals with mental health or psychiatric conditions, 40% on individuals with visual impairments or blindness, and 1 in 3, 35% focused on those with chronic illness. Just to give a picture of how these churches were thinking about who in their community they were wanting to welcome and support and include. We also asked about aspects of congregational life that they were striving to make more accessible. And here too, we saw many variations across these congregations. Again, the gold bar chart will indicate the percentages of congregations that were thinking about accessibility and inclusion in these aspects of faith community life. 78% focused on accessibility and supports during religious education or Sunday school. 75% were in some way intentional about universal design, responsive design during their worship services. 72% focused on family supports. 71% on fellowship and social activities. 56% on small groups, life groups, or community groups. 48% on service activities. And 35% on missions or outreach. Most churches were at the place where they primarily focused on a couple or a few of these areas, but some were thinking more broadly about all aspects of congregational life. What prompted the movements of these congregations? Well, the initial catalysts in most churches we spoke with, I think they're important to consider. In sharing their ministry's origin stories, many of the leaders we spoke with described a reactive posture. Their ministries were launched when someone in their church encountered disability at birth or through accident or aging, or when a new family arrived for the first time. And so they mobilized as a church to make sure that those members and their families were supported and welcomed well. A new ministry was born. But some of the leaders also described a proactive posture. Someone in their church recognized unmet needs in their local community and began to pursue children and families who'd not yet arrived. A parent who knew of so many other families who struggled to find a church that would welcome them back. A special educator who knew of so many teenagers with disabilities in her school who just longed to belong. And a new ministry was born in those congregations. More and more faith communities are responding. More and more are being proactive, anticipating, expecting. Is yours? Well, second, we noticed examples of considerable innovation. We were struck by the breadth and depth of many of these churches' movements. Whether programmatically or informally, churches were identifying ordinary and creative ways of designing or redesigning worship and learning and service and fellowship activities with a broader range of members in mind, of fostering relationships and connections within and beyond the buildings all throughout the week. For example, we found that 94% of these churches were incorporating one or more universal design principles into worship: communication supports, sensory supports, technology supports, accessibility features. We found that 86% of these churches were coming alongside families in active ways by offering respite care, hosting small groups or Bible studies, providing pastoral counseling, offering informational workshops or other practical assistance. 3/4 of these churches were taking steps to promote greater awareness and acceptance through Access Sundays, through thoughtful preaching series, by hosting book studies. And we found that just under half, 47% of churches, were in some way partnering with local community agencies and disability organizations to invite more widely. And I'll come back to those partnerships in a bit. For example, a small church in Pennsylvania budgets to send every one of their families to family camp every year. Another church in Alabama sends a small delegation of caring members to the school IEP meetings for every autistic child they serve. A large church in Tennessee hosts a free lending library of medical equipment. A church in Oklahoma welcomed their first deacon with Down syndrome. A church in Delaware hosts annual appreciation events to honor direct support providers working throughout their city. A tiny church in Tennessee now has nearly half of their members learning sign language to better embrace one deaf member. And we spoke with 6 different church plants around the country that were centered on the participation and leadership of people with developmental disabilities. Much of this emerged when congregations paused and reflected together, prayerful reflection on their mission and their vision, on their practices, on their partnerships, on their theology, and more. Reflection with disabled members and with families about the opportunities and needs in front of them. Reflection with. Our congregation should be steeped in innovation and imagination, striving to widen their welcome. Is yours? Well, third, more churches are embracing inclusive models of ministry, where members with and without disabilities are expected and supported to participate in the same breadth of valued experiences as anyone else. It's an intentional shift in posture from ministry apart from people to ministry with people with developmental disabilities. In those churches where inclusion abounds, ministry leaders emphasize the importance of casting a vision, of equipping leaders and volunteers throughout the church, of fostering awareness and personalizing supports, of embracing flexibility and reflecting regularly and listening carefully. They talked about complicated, sometimes even contentious journeys, and change in congregations can be that way sometimes. But their commitment to inclusion was grounded in core theological understandings of the body and of the banquet. And the absence of asterisks and the abundance of those one another's throughout Scripture led them to wonder why it would be any other way. For example, 82% of the churches that were part of our project actively supported the involvement of children with disabilities in their typical Sunday school programs. They were intentional about the curriculum they selected. They drew upon the support of same-age peers or adults. They equipped their religious education leaders on inclusive teaching practices, or they developed written support plans for individual children. In the area of worship, we saw many examples of how churches were moving beyond that veneer of accessibility and adopting more universal design principles. In a related study that preceded this project, we asked 40 Christians with disabilities about what makes worship accessible, and they emphasized 15 aspects of worship, which more and more churches we saw were beginning to attend to, and I'll put each of these up on the screen. These included attending to the architecture, to attitudes, to how things are communicated, to making sure people have opportunities to share their gifts and serve others and lead on contributions. They talked about expectations, those unspoken assumptions about behavior that's expected or encouraged or allowed. They talked about reflecting on the interactions that take place before and during after service. They emphasized the liturgy, the structure and sequence and predictability of worship services. And they talked about the importance of our postures, of being flexible and adaptable in worship. They emphasized the importance of fostering a sense of community and making sure that individualized supports were available for people who are part of the congregation. They talked about other factors like technology and the way that's integrated into worship services. They talked a lot about theology, about the beliefs we have related to disability or statements about how God views disability. They talked about the importance, the necessity of transportation, and the importance of thinking about how information is presented through preaching, readings, and other information in understandable ways. In the afternoon plenary today, we'll talk a lot more about disability-centered worship through a different lens, so there's more to come. My point is that more and more of these churches were thinking about accessibility within the context of worship, and universal design often then enabled inclusion. Some of the leaders that we interviewed talked about how inclusion in one area of their church, such as worship, started to lead to deeper inclusion in others. That there was a ripple effect, slow, certainly, but noticeable. And as disabled and non-disabled members shared their faith and their friendships, their care and their companionship, these churches tended to pull farther away from practices and programs that would prevent those kinds of exchanges. In other words, they discovered the blessings of life lived together. Our faith community should be the most inclusive places in our city. Is yours? Well, fourth, something extraordinary happens when we worship as one. When we learn and serve and fellowship together, that sort of faithfulness brings real flourishing. And more congregations are discovering that our collective efforts are enriched and enlivened by the presence when the presence and participation of people with and without disabilities are supported. In our interviews, we asked leaders about the impact of their ministry on people with intellectual and developmental disabilities and their families. And I doubt their answers would surprise you. They talked about spiritual growth and discipleship, about deeper involvement in the life of their church, new friendships, the experience of belonging, access to much-needed care, practical supports, opportunities to serve, encounters with love. This is the fruit maybe you see in your own ministries as well. A wider welcome is good for kids with disabilities and their families. But about half of the ministry leaders shared a fuller story. They talked about the reciprocity they discovered in the midst of this work. The leading theme of their conversations was how the whole church was more faithful and flourishing because people with and without disabilities were befriending and loving and serving and supporting and praying for one another. How all sorts of people started to experience spiritual growth and discipleship and deeper involvement and new friendships and belonging when they revisited how and where they gathered. When people who had not previously encountered one another began to befriend one another, things started to change in those congregations as well. So there's a real sort of image there of flourishing together in community with one another. So do any of these four trends resemble what you see in your own congregations? Is there, as I put on the screen, is there accelerating interests? Are we innovating practices? Are we embracing inclusion? And are we flourishing together? While there's much to celebrate, there's much more movement that's needed. The current landscape of disability ministry also reveals opportunities that are being missed or only partially realized. The first of those is that the movements of churches are incredibly uneven. And I suspect this is true of other faith traditions as well. It quickly becomes apparent when you hear the church stories of people with disabilities and their families. Stories of extravagant welcome are sometimes followed by stories of deep wounding, and it's still hard to predict which of those that you'll hear as people begin to share. but it was evident in so many of the conversations with the leaders that we interviewed, who often said that they were the only congregation in their city or county that was actively pursuing the presence of their neighbors with disabilities. And while they are proud of their ministries, they did not aspire to stand alone in that space. They wanted inclusive ministry to be an unremarkable thing in their community. So yes, there's accelerating interest nationally, but it still remains the exception rather than the rule. We readily recruited 200 congregations to our study. I'm not confident we could have found 2,000 or 20,000. And in many areas and regions, we struggled to find any congregations that were intentional about this work. For example, there are 392 congregations here in McLennan County. That's Waco County, not 350,000, right? How many would say they are invested in this work? There's 1,400 congregations in Metro Austin, 5,000 in Metro Houston, 6,500 in Dallas-Fort Worth, 29,000 throughout the state. What proportion of those 350,000 places of worship still need to be stirred in some ways? So there's much more work to do there as well. And how do we catalyze more movement? Well, one opportunity I think often involves engaging smaller congregations. In our study of disability and ministry, found the average size church that had an intentional ministry in this way was actually close to 1,000. In other words, bigger churches tend to be the ones that launch these formal ministries, and yet the average or median-sized congregation is around 100. How do we strengthen those invitations to smaller congregations? What guidance do they need? What models of ministry might make sense for their context? There's this looming sense we hear among smaller congregations that they're not large enough or resourced enough or expert enough or fill in the blank enough to step into this space. And yet we also see smaller congregations getting it right when it comes to relationships and embracing people one person at a time. What role might your faith community play in spurring other congregations in your community or in your county to join you on this journey? Well, second, in terms of movements that are needed, is churches still lean heavily on ministry models that are separate or even segregated. This is particularly true within ministries centered on individuals with intellectual and developmental disabilities. For example, 77% of churches in our study offered different Sunday school classes or Bible studies just for adults with intellectual or developmental disabilities. More than half of church held social events designed only for those members. 1 in 7 churches held separate vacation Bible school programs for those individuals as well. And there's more information I can share about kind of those practices and sort of what that might look like in many ways. But in many cases, though not all, this was the only option available to these children and adults. It was the de facto choice made before ever meeting them. So I'm not talking about congregation here, but about separation. And when a parallel ministry emerges in which the lives of people with and without developmental disabilities rarely intersect, it limits who we come to know, whose gifts we come to encounter, whose friendships we have the opportunity to experience. So for every church that we interviewed that struggled to include a particular person or a segment of their community, it was interesting that we spoke to another church that had figured it out and had done it well. And for every church that was convinced that a particular way of gathering just couldn't be changed, we spoke with another church that showed it could. For every church, there was another church. How might congregations reimagine our programs and activities so there really is a place for everyone? Third, there's an enduring opportunity for ministries to reach between or beyond Sundays. And now this is when most, certainly not all, Christian congregations meet, so between services. And this is intriguing to me to think about thinking between Sundays, because according to my very rigorous research, very rigorous, there are 7 days in the week. I am a researcher, I know this. I actually checked many of the local calendars. So I've placed on the screen 3 different Texas 2023 calendars, one for the Rangers, one for the Dallas Cowboys, and a picture of one featuring blue bonnets. All of them had 7 days. And then I thought, this is a religious gathering. I checked religious calendars. I put 3 of those up on the screen as well, 3 different religious calendars, all of them same story, 7 days. Bad joke, I get. But in so many churches that we studied, most planning and programming focused on a few hours on Sunday morning or on Saturday, whenever they gathered, supporting involvement in worship services and religious education. And no doubt that investment is really important. But what if that was the starting point rather than the stopping point? What if the most powerful ministry opportunities actually take place between Sundays, or between Saturdays, or between Fridays, after the benediction or dismissal? And people meet one another certainly in those times, but friendships are usually forged in the times in between. We learned about so many intriguing ways that congregations were helping their members to flourish the other 6 days of the week. A church in Michigan helps connect young adults with developmental disabilities to community jobs aligned with their sense of gift, their gifting, and their sense of calling. A church in Indiana supports community living options by matching interested members to adults with disabilities who need a companion. A church in Colorado hosts unified sports events all throughout the year. A church in Wisconsin uses their accessible van to address transportation needs of members Monday through Friday. A church in Tennessee launched a New Day program right out of their building, but only 10% of congregations that we interviewed had any of this broader focus. And of course, there's all sorts of ways to come alongside families as well. How might we, our faith communities, promote the flourishing of people with developmental disabilities all 7 days of the week? And fourth, the final of the movements that I wanted to just highlight is that friendship should abound in our congregations. Fourth is fostering deep relationships. We were created for community, and one of the most powerful gifts we can receive from someone else is the gift of friendship, something Hans Reminders has reminded us of so well through his writing and through the life he lives. But friendships were not always easy or automatic, and they don't emerge simply because people are part of the same congregation or because someone launched a formal ministry. And they can be especially elusive for children and adults with developmental disabilities. So many of the leaders that we interviewed talked about the challenges of facilitating reciprocal relationships among the people they supported and others throughout their church. Finding volunteers was one thing, fostering friendships was quite another. Is there someone she can eat with and walk with and celebrate with and cry with and play with or pray with or shop with or do nothing with? Names should abound for every person. And so the opportunity here is to design ministries that create deep relationships and belonging, that prioritize relationships. This is much more than about sharing space on Sunday. It's about sharing our lives throughout the week. It's much less about the programs we offer and more about the people we introduce each other to. And what would this look like? We heard so many examples of ways congregations are just connecting people in shared activities around common interests over time. And in some ways, that's kind of a recipe for friendship in a sense. Shared activities around common experiences and interests, and you do that over time, and people start picking one another as friends. But when our ministry models prevent those encounters, it shouldn't surprise us when friendships can be elusive. How can our ministries encourage and support these everyday encounters, and who else might benefit in our congregations when we're intentional about fostering relationships? So here's the needed movements. What are the opportunities that you see in your own faith community? How might you spur more congregations along, adopt inclusive practices, think between Sundays, and foster more friendships? Well, I hope this brief glimpse into the current landscape of disability ministry is helpful. It's a mix of some encouraging trends, some enduring needs. And let me close with just a few reflections for those of you who are serving in organizations or denominations that come along faith communities in this work. I think your work matters more than ever. The first is that we need to strengthen guidance and supports for new ministry leaders. So many people we interviewed were essentially making their way on their own. They brought great enthusiasm, but little training. They brought deep desire, but had little direction. And how might we work together in creative ways to make it easier for congregations to find and access excellent resources and training and support throughout the year? What form could that take here in the heart of Texas and beyond? And second, we need more effective ways of engaging and equipping clergy. In almost every church that we studied, disability ministry was born bottom up rather than top down. In other words, pastors were very rarely the catalysts, and they often needed regular convincing. The exception was usually when they were also the parent of a child with disabilities. But indeed, so many of the people we interviewed said they struggled to get the full investment of their congregation's leaders. How might we go where clergy gather? How might we cast this call in new ways and places so this vision for inclusion and belonging permeates every faith community? And I think third, that means we have to transform our preparation programs. There are more than 200 seminaries and theological schools across North America, a similar number of religious colleges and universities, yet only a handful give serious attention to the intersection of disability and ministry. How might we elevate attention to disability in all of the places where clergy, youth ministry leaders, worship leaders, children's ministry leaders receive their formative training, so that we're not having to fill those gaps in on the back end? What would that look like here at Baylor? What would that look like in the theological schools that are affiliated with your tradition? And fourth, we need more systemic ways of inviting and influencing congregations on a broader scale. There are 350,000 congregations across the United States. How do we help them widen their welcome as well? How do we partner in new ways with denominations and ministry networks and associations and even other movements to begin to amplify this call and engage thousands more congregations in reflection and also in response? Well, with all of those recommendations in mind, let me conclude by putting up on the screen the same series of those 5 images of the circles that I mentioned earlier at the outset of this talk, that series of circles. Which of these 5 portraits describes the communities that you worship in, or serve in, or work in, or learn in, or live in? Is your congregation marked by exclusion, by separation, by integration, by inclusion, or belonging? And I think there's an invitation that emerges out of this for all of us to be catalysts for change in the ministries and the communities that we're part of, to spur congregations towards practices and postures that deepen their commitment, that widen their welcome, that strengthen the embrace of every member. No exceptions, no asterisks, so that everyone really does belong. Thank you. So the conversation is now going to shift from up here to your tables as you reflect on the landscape that I shared and connect it to your own context and experiences. So at each of your tables and also in the breakout rooms, we're going to ask you at your tables to begin by introducing yourselves and then conversing around 3 questions that are on your tables and on the screen, and I'll read them right now. What insights do you have from your own ministries and experiences that connect to this? What challenges and questions arise in this area? And which portraits of community describe your own congregation and why? So this is a chance to meet others, to listen to and learn from others, to make some new friends. So you can go through these questions at your own pace. We'll have about 15 minutes or so you won't get through them all. And then someone will come back to the podium around 10:40, and we'll dismiss everyone to a short break. And then after that break, we'll have a conversation with a panel and a Q&A to engage around these questions in a more deep and fuller way. All right? So start with brief introductions and then begin to engage around these 3 questions.